Welcome back. We're going to finish up the civil rights movement in the 1960s today. You should have previously gone over the early civil rights movement. And again, I just want to emphasize how mind-blowing to me the civil rights movement was, because of everything that the people who participated in it went through. And so, whether they went through a march or registered to vote or stood up for what they believed was right, I feel that we really need to celebrate everyone that was involved in the civil rights movement. We finished up on the early civil rights movement talking about one of the first sit-ins that happened, and I just want to real quickly show you some images from one particular sit-in. This one took place in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963. Again, this was a Woolworth's department store, and several college students and their professor planned it. What we see in this image, we see two of the participants of the sit-in, okay? A lady named Ann Moody, and this is a lady named Joan Trumpauer. This is their professor, a man named John Salter. And they participated in this sit-in to demonstrate the need for integration of this lunch counter. They sat down at the lunch counter roughly around lunchtime. Across the street from the department store was a high school that had open lunch, so the students could go across the street. And when they walked in and saw this, they became enraged. You see, maybe you can make out this guy right here, this older gentleman who egged the students on. And what they did to the protesters, you see something's been rubbed in Ann Moody's hair. They're getting ready to pour, I don't know if that's salt or a drink. Okay. Professor Salter looks like he's had something thrown on him. There's a wonderful book out there called Coming of Age in Mississippi. It is Ann Moody's autobiography where she talks about her experiences in segregation. But she talks about this particular sit-in and how they were beaten and they were thrown to the ground. Joan was physically picked up by one of the teenagers and thrown outside, and yet she came back in to sit back down at the lunch counter. Eventually, within about 30 minutes, people from the college came to pick up the protesters. Now, I wanted to go through that because we think in our sanitized version of the civil rights movement what a sit-in was. Well, you just sat there until you were served, right? You sat there until you couldn't physically take it anymore. Sit-ins are not met with indifference. They are met with physical assaults. Please understand that. That people put their lives on the line to sit down at a place where they could get something to drink. And so, please remember these images. Another reason to show you these images, one of the great things that I've been able to do in my life was meet Joan Trumpauer, the young white woman who helped participate in this sit-in. To think that I was able to actually sit with someone who was a well-known participant of the civil rights movement. It's just something that kind of blew my mind when I met her, and continues to blow my mind to this day. Anyway, getting back to the civil rights movement. These people that were part of it engaged in non-violent protest. And their non-violent protest against segregation continued to spread across the South throughout the early 1960s. And of course, most of the time, those protests were met with violence being directed at the protesters. Sometimes not on the day of the protest, sometimes after the protest, which I'll mention later. In 1961, something's going to take place called the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were organized by SNCC and supported by CORE, and what they were going to be college-aged students riding interstate buses. Think Greyhound. riding these interstate buses from the north into the south. And what they were going to do was they were going to integrate the bus terminals in the south that were segregated by law. You see, when you go to catch the bus, for those of you that have never done it, if you go to something like Greyhound or Trailways, you have to arrive at the bus terminal, and there should be a waiting area. And in the South, the waiting areas were segregated, obviously, between black and white. But in many of the smaller bus terminals, the segregation was white people could sit on the inside while African Americans had to sit in the outside, in some cases, next to the running buses. And if you've ever walked by a car or a bus and happened to breathe in at the wrong time, you've smelled those fumes, now taken back to the 1960s before emission standards were a thing, and they're having to breathe those in, and it's hot. And so the Freedom Riders are going to try to call attention to this and try to force integration of this. And wherever the Freedom Riders went, they encountered resistance. In Birmingham, Alabama, the police commissioner is a man named Bull Connor. And he actually planned to allow a mob to beat the Freedom Riders as they came off the bus, as they pulled into Birmingham. He had already made the deal. The leader of the mob, they were going to be given 15 minutes before Bull Connor and the police went in to restore order. And when they did go in to restore order, they were going to arrest the Freedom Riders for inciting a riot. Up the road from Birmingham, before they actually stopped there, one of the buses was firebombed. And so you see this bus here on fire, and the mob actually tried to hold the front door shut to keep the riders inside so that they would burn to death. Now, fortunately, either someone kicked out a back window. There are multiple versions of the story. One says that some of the riders were able to get out the back, and another says that a fuel tank on the bus exploded and the mob became distracted long enough for the riders to force the front doors open, and everybody was able to get off the bus without being killed. But they were still beaten. And this was reported, and it was photographed, and it was filmed, and it was shown on TV. And the resulting media coverage is what is going to make John F. Kennedy order the Justice Department to begin suing bus terminals, interstate bus terminals that were segregated, saying this was a violation of federal law. And so, even though the Freedom Rides came to an end because of the violence, they still served an important purpose. As part of their nonviolent protest, many of the different organizations and leaders would plan marches and, I don't want to call them parades, but demonstrations and rallies to denounce the oppression that they faced. And again, many of these were met by violence. In Birmingham, Alabama, again, in 1963, okay, Martin Luther King was leading a peaceful march, and the police moved in and started to arrest many of the leaders, including Martin Luther King. It is then, while he is in jail, that Martin Luther King wrote his, maybe you've heard of it, his letter from Birmingham jail. This is an important part of Dr. King's writings for several reasons. Number one, it outlines his use of nonviolent protest. Okay. Why did nonviolence have to be used? Okay. He also used letter as an opportunity to respond to people who criticized him, saying that he was an outsider. He was responding to the defenders of segregation, who said that, look, the people in our community accept this system. And Martin Luther King is some outside agitator coming in to cause these problems. Okay. And one of his famous quotations also comes from this letter: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So it's also a call to action on the part of those who are sitting there going, well, I see something wrong, but I don't know what I can do about it. Another nonviolent protest that would be infamous is this thing called the March from Selma to Montgomery. Okay? This takes place again in Alabama, and the purpose of the march was to put pressure on the state of Alabama to enact legislation that would protect people's civil rights and their voting rights. And so the march was planned. They were going to march all the way from Selma to Montgomery, which is the capital of Alabama. Well, as they left Selma on the morning of March 7th, 1965, okay, as they start marching, in order to get out of Selma, they have to go across a bridge. It's called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And as they come over the bridge, they were stopped by police. The police said that the march was over, that they were not going to be allowed to continue. The leaders of the march actually said, very well, we understand. We will disperse as soon as we are done praying. And they knelt down to pray. And as they did that, the police fired tear gas into the crowd. They released dogs into the crowd. And they marched in with their batons and their clubs and beat the marchers as they broke up this peaceful march. Now, eventually, John F. Kennedy, the government, because of this, is going to go in. The government is going to send federal law enforcement down, U.S. Marshals, to protect the marchers. So the march from Selma to Montgomery did happen. And one of the things that the nonviolent protest accomplished, even though you think, well, what did they accomplish when they were constantly met by violence? Well, television exists. And so all these images, Bloody Sunday, Martin Luther King's arrest, all these things are shown on television. And so people, not only in the United States, but around the world, get to see exactly what the American South is like. And the reason the nonviolent protest was so important for Dr. King's strategy was nowhere in those photographs or videos was there any picture of a protester starting the fight. It was always the police. And so there was never any way for the supporters of segregation to spin those videos and say, well, the protesters really started it. Because there's not one single photograph. Okay? In fact, because this is known worldwide, that is one thing that was an embarrassment for the United States on the international stage when we would go before something like the United Nations and we would accuse the Soviet Union of human rights violations, which they were guilty of. And they would just pull up the photos of Selma or Birmingham. And they would show that and say, let's talk about your abuses of people's rights. And there wasn't anything that the United States could say about that. Because all that was shown was the violent reactions. And I have here a photo. It doesn't show a violent reaction. But it does show something that I want to point out. You have the peaceful marchers going to ask the state government to protect their civil rights. And here on the side of the road, you have a counter-protester holding up a Confederate flag. And I don't know anybody's history. I know my family's history. I know who was in the country and who wasn't in the country and when they were and when they weren't. And for everyone who says that this Confederate flag is not about hate, look at this picture. Why else would he be holding up a Confederate flag, if not to direct hate at these people? What is he saying to these people? Is he saying, this flag flies to represent you? You could have had freedom if you'd been under this flag? No. He's flying this flag in their faces. He's flying it to prove his point that what they're doing in his mind is wrong. They're fighting for equality, and he says that's wrong. And it doesn't matter what that flag stood for in 1861 or 1864 or 1865. By the time you get to the 1960s, that flag is being used to intimidate. And so whatever you think it's being used for, at some point, you have to admit, it was at the very least corrupted. And that's why people have such a problem with the Confederate flag being flown. Because it does represent hate and violence and intimidation to the people that stood up for what was right. Now, probably the most well-known march was the March on Washington. Okay? This March on Washington happened in August of 1963. We kind of equate it with Martin Luther King, but he was not actually an organizer. There were many different civil rights organizations that helped plan and organize this, and it was not just the March on Washington. It was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And you see all the signs that the people are holding here in this photograph, okay? We demand equal rights now. We march for integrated schools. We demand decent housing, okay? And so there were so many people and so many things that they said, look, segregation and discrimination is keeping us from these things. And the purpose of the whole march was to force Congress and John F. Kennedy to put their weight behind the passage of a new civil rights bill, one that would actually be able to make a difference. Over 200,000 people showed up to attend this March on Washington. Now, of course, we associate the March on Washington with Martin Luther King because he gave one of the keynote addresses, and it's probably the most famous speech that is given during the Civil Rights Movement, the I Have a Dream speech, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And it did push Kennedy to work on a civil rights bill and to put the weight of the presidency behind the civil rights bill. But keep in mind, it's August of 63. Kennedy will be dead by the end of November of 1963. But where Kennedy died, Lyndon Johnson took over. Lyndon Johnson puts his full support behind passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay? Lyndon Johnson was a supporter of civil rights. We might find this to be ironic because he grew up in Texas, in a segregated Texas. But he did support the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation. And so the Civil Rights Act of 64, as Congress passes it, bans discrimination in all public accommodations. Okay? It prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Okay? Congress found all these things that said, wait, how are people discriminated against? And they started working these things into the bill. A bit of trivia. Banning discrimination on the basis of sex was originally not in there. That was actually added by a Southerner as an amendment to the bill. But the reason he added it was to kill the bill. See, our Southern congressman who said, well, let's ban discrimination on the basis of sex, he felt that, oh, surely all the men in Congress would say, well, there are certain things women can't do. And so I'll put this in here, and then that is something called a poison pill. It was designed to make people vote against the bill, but instead, enough congressmen looked at it and went, oh, wait, you're right. We should have put that in there originally. Good catch, buddy. And so it does ban discrimination on the basis of sex as well. LBJ also supported the ratification of the 24th Amendment. Okay? The 24th Amendment banned the use of the poll tax. Poll taxes were something that was used in the South where you had to pay in order to vote. And the reason the poll tax was introduced was to keep African Americans from being able to vote. It's not necessarily a whole lot of money, but it was enough that if you're poor, you can't afford to pay it. And I'm kind of blown away by the picture up in the top left corner. Pay your poll tax, vote, and protect your rights and privileges. And yet paying the poll tax is something that is designed to keep someone from exercising their rights and privileges. LBJ also, as I guess this is part of the civil rights movement, he appoints Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall is the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court. If you remember back to the early civil rights lecture, he was the lawyer for Linda Brown in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is obviously extremely important. It's probably going to be in one of my top 10 most important laws in U.S. history. But just because people had their civil rights didn't necessarily mean they had their full voting rights. In June of 1964, there's something going on called Mississippi Freedom Summer. The goal of the Mississippi Freedom Summer was to get people registered to vote. And during that summer, during that Mississippi Freedom Summer, there were 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi who were murdered. And their whole sin was that they had attempted to register African Americans to vote in Mississippi. Okay? This was the poster that the FBI put up as they started looking for them. Andrew Goodman on the left and Michael Schwimmer on the right. They were both from New York. James Chaney, who is in the middle, he was from Mississippi. And all 3 of these people knew what potentially could happen. If you watch interviews of the people that worked on Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, when they had to respond to the fact that these people were missing, many times they said, "We know what can happen to us. We know the dangers." Some of them even said, "Yes, we're scared, but we're willing to do this because it's the right thing to do." Maybe you've heard of an artist named Norman Rockwell. Okay? Norman Rockwell did this painting of these 3 men who were being executed by local members of the KKK. It was the public outrage from their executions that moved Congress eventually to pass something called the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which did several things. The most important thing it did was it prohibited race-based discrimination in voting, but it also allowed the federal government to step in and required the federal courts to sign off on changes in electoral procedures in areas that had a history of discrimination in voting. So that includes, of course, all of the South, in addition to a couple of other places here and there that are mentioned in the law. Now, the on-paper obtaining of civil rights and voting rights is the high water mark of the civil rights movement. And that's true. Unfortunately for the movement, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, many of the groups that had been united in trying to achieve the Civil Rights Act and achieve the Voting Rights Act, they became less and less united as each organization started moving in a different direction, seeking to advance different goals and different plans. Some of the organizations were based in areas that were impoverished, and they said, look, we need to focus on economics now. We need to focus on the idea of African Americans having better access to jobs and access to equal pay and different kinds of opportunities. Some were located in the cities, and they said, well, you know, being in rural poverty is completely different than being in urban poverty, and so we need to focus on conditions in the inner cities and education here. Still others said, well, now that we've achieved civil rights legislation that targets the South, we now need to move to the North. because up in the north, they still had de facto segregation in practice. This photograph of Martin Luther King is taken as he had moved up to an all-white suburb of Chicago. He had moved his family there, and he was leading a protest, a civil rights protest, in an all-white suburb of Chicago. And this photograph is taken immediately after he had been hit in the head by someone throwing a rock in the north. My grandmother, who lived through the civil rights movement, once said, you know, when the civil rights movement happened in the South, everyone saw what it was like, and everyone knew that it was bad. But then it moved up north, and we all learned that those people were just as racist as we were. And so, the movement goes in many different directions here. In addition to that, through the 1960s, you had an increase in more militant protest. Martin Luther King is associated with the nonviolent protest, but you also started to see some more militant protest going on during the 1960s, and as it continued to move on, it got even more prominent, and it got more publicity. Between 1965 and 1968, we have the existence of something called the Long Hot Summers. During those years, there were major protests and riots in many of the major cities in the United States. And some of those protests and riots were race riots. Okay? You've got other things going on during that time, and we'll talk about those in later lectures. But some of these are race riots. Okay? One of the advocates of the more militant protest was a group called the Nation of Islam. In the 1960s, it was led by this man, Elijah Muhammad. You may have never heard of him, but you may have heard of the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X. Malcolm X is known for not promoting violence. That is one easy foil that it is easy to make. I've seen people say that Martin Luther King stood for nonviolence and Malcolm X stood for violence, and that's not correct. Malcolm X one time said, when asked about the use of violence and whatever else, Malcolm X said, "We will be nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us. But we will not be nonviolent with people who are violent against us." And so the idea of equating him with violence is incorrect, but he and others are starting to say, look, when African Americans are met with violence, they need to be ready to fight back. The Nation of Islam also called for separatism. That is the opposite of integration. They called for the complete separation of the races. And so, that in turn hurts the civil rights movement, because you have the civil rights movement promoting integration, and then all of a sudden you have this other group that was popular in some areas of the country among African Americans saying the exact opposite. You also have the existence in the 60s of the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement is best articulated by a young man named Stokely Carmichael, who said that what the Black Power movement was African Americans taking control of their own political, economic, social destiny. The idea that the movement for their own rights had to be led by African Americans. There was also, as part of this Black Power movement, there was a celebration of Black identity. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a phrase that was used in the African American community: "Black is beautiful." And so part of that Black Power movement, there was a group called the Black Panther Party that was founded out in California by these two guys, Bobby Seale on the left and Huey Newton on the right. And the Black Panther Party, they get kind of a bad rap in history, especially in the survey textbooks that just real quickly kind of go through everything. They do have a mixed record of what they did. But the Black Panther Party, one of the things that they did was they provided for people in their community. They provided for people who were out of work and needed food. They provided preschool type education. They would kind of patrol the streets to take care of their elderly neighbors when young people, maybe crime in the neighborhood was bad. And so the Black Panthers would patrol the streets to take care of that, take care of their own community. Okay? Now, they also got into confrontations with police officers. Okay? They also were involved in shootouts. And so they do have kind of a mixed record, but it's important not to just look at one side or the other, but to look at both of those as a whole. Now, as far as this Black Power movement goes, and the idea of African Americans taking control of their own political destiny, probably one of the best examples of that is SNCC. In 1968, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of these civil rights groups that was promoting civil rights, voted to remove all white members from the group. And so this group that had been founded on the idea of reaching equality for everyone else kicked out a group of people saying, we don't want you here. And so that's kind of interesting. And again, that fractures the movement. As you have people saying, I want to help, and then being rejected by that. 1968 is going to be a very critical year in U.S. history. You are going to see this year in several different incarnations. And so as we hit kind of the end here of the civil rights movement, you see it here, 1968, in terms of the civil rights movement. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to support striking sanitation workers who were fighting for better wages and better conditions. In June of 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, the brother of John Kennedy. He was running for president. And this is significant in the civil rights movement because he was a strong supporter of civil rights. And so you have these two people that were both associated with the civil rights movement that were assassinated in 1968. And so after 1968, you think, what do you hear of the civil rights movement after that? It's very difficult. There are later efforts to achieve better equality, greater equality. There's a policy called affirmative action you may have heard of before. It is the use of quotas in awarding jobs or contracts or whatever. These can be, the affirmative action systems can be adopted by governments. It can be adopted by businesses. What they do is they require a certain number of minorities or a certain percentage of minorities to receive whatever award it is in whatever system it is you're trying to set up. The idea behind affirmative action is that these efforts will help make up for discrimination in the past. In local education, in local school districts that were trying to live up to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, because of the way schools are set up. Schools are usually neighborhood schools. Neighborhoods tend to be homogeneous. In other words, you have one group that lives within the neighborhood, and so schools tend to be homogeneous. They tend to look like the neighborhoods that surround them. But because school districts are required to integrate, and you can't have one school that is 95% white and one school that is 95% black in the same district, school districts have to figure out how do we fix this. And so some school districts started using something called busing. Busing is where the school district will take students from one neighborhood and bus them over to a school in a completely different neighborhood. Again, the idea to achieve racial balance in the schools. We'll take African Americans from their neighborhood and take them to the quote-unquote white school, and we'll take students from the white neighborhood and take them to the quote-unquote black school, And once both schools are 50-50, we should be good. The results of those things, they have gotten pushback. And here we are in 2020 now, and these programs still get pushback. There are arguments that some of the efforts to achieve racial diversity actually cause what some people refer to as reverse discrimination. The idea that, well, you can't take advantage of this because you are white. Well, wait, that doesn't seem fair to me because I feel like I'm being discriminated against. Oh, no, no, no. The idea is not to discriminate. There's a court case. Regents of the University of California versus Bach. Alan Bach was trying to get into medical school. And when he applied to medical school, he did not get in. But he learned that there were African Americans getting in that had lower grades and lower test scores than he did. And he sued the University of California over this. And the Supreme Court, when he got to the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court learned was that the University of California said, we are going to have X number of African American students in our medical program. And because that took up however many seats that were, he couldn't get in, and essentially the only reason the University of California wouldn't let him in was because he was white. And so the Supreme Court ruled in this case that rigid racial quotas, a rigid number, is actually unconstitutional. Now they went on to say that race could be one of many factors considered in order to allow someone in. So there was a young woman several years ago who sued the University of Texas, claiming that she did not get into the University of Texas because she was white. That case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against her, saying that the University of Texas, while they did take race into account in their admissions, they took many other factors in, that it was one of a whole host of factors. The other results of the civil rights movement, there's other movements that were inspired by the civil rights movement. There's a Hispanic rights movement. There's a Hispanic civil rights movement that is inspired by what they see in the 50s and the 60s. There's the feminist movement or the women's rights movement, however you want to refer to that. That many of them were active in the civil rights movement, and because they saw people being discriminated against, and then they also saw themselves being discriminated against. The modern LGBTQ movement has taken inspiration from the civil rights movement, saying that they face some of the same forms of discrimination in terms of, say, marriage equality, when interracial marriage used to be illegal. Now, the other results of the civil rights movement is we still have and we still see racial disparities in many, many different areas in our society. Many of those are economic and in education. And these are all things that are very difficult for us to look at because we want to say, well, the civil rights movement happened. It fixed everything, right? Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they were pieces of paper. It still requires people to put those ideas into practice. And so here, just some statistics. Okay, educational attainment in the United States by race. Okay, you see African Americans are more likely to drop out of high school. Okay, you see, the numbers in high school, it looks like, percentage-wise, African Americans are doing better. In some colleges, it looks like they're doing better. But associate's degree, finishing that 2-year degree, finishing a bachelor's degree, okay, finishing an advanced degree, a master's or a PhD, they still are behind in terms of who is in jail, who is in prison in the United States. Percent-wise, on the left, we see the percent of the population of the United States that each group represents. And then we see the percent that they are in jail. If justice is administered equally, and we have everyone committing the same percentage of crimes, the graph on the left and the graph on the right should look the same, but instead, it doesn't. Okay? In terms of medical care, okay, this is from one particular county in the South. what percent of the babies that are born are what race, and what percent of the babies that die are each race. That is a huge disparity. Okay? And then in terms of unemployment, in terms of economics, okay, what is the annual income? Okay, what is the unemployment rate? Okay, African Americans continue to be hurt by this. And so the civil rights movement did see some successes. But I believe we also have a long way to go. And when you look at statistics, it's hard to argue that. Thanks for listening.